day, as he was sleeping underneath the tree, what should happen to poor King Solomon but he felt a terrible, terrible sting on his nose. And when he awoke, it had swollen to the size of a plum. Well, he was angry and in a lot of pain, and so hopping around, who has done this? Who has done this? And what should happen? But all of the insects came buzzing. Can you help me bring in the insects and buzz with me? And so King Solomon, who, as you remember, could speak to them, said, "You fly, you see everything. Who has stung me?" But the insects just said, "Where's the stars, Solomon? We didn't see this." Until finally, a very, very small, very, very young bee buzzed up to him, said, "Pardon, Your Majesty. You see, I'm very young, and I cannot tell the difference yet between a fine nose like yours and a flower." Well, King Solomon's nose had now swollen to the size of a coconut, and so he was not in a very forgiving mood. He took up a fly swatter and said, "Tell me why I should not swat you. I have swatted warriors for less than this." But the little bee said, "I promise if you show me mercy, I will repay you one day." And King Solomon just laughed. "You're a bee. How are you going to repay me?" But the bee said, "Remember the story of the mouse and the elephant. The elephant thought a teeny tiny mouse could never be useful to him until he needed a thorn removed from his foot. I promise I may be small, but someday you will be happy you spared my life." Well, King Solomon said, "You have spoken so wisely that I will indeed let you go. But go now before I change my mind." And so, with a buzz, the bee left, and all of the other insects away. Time passed, and King Solomon forgot all about his nose because it returned to its normal size, and he forgot all about the little bee. Until one day, Balkis, the Queen of Sheba, came to visit him and test his wisdom. For she was known in her kingdom as the wisest of queens. And she had heard that there was this man somewhere else who was known as the wisest of kings. So she wanted to see which of them was truly the wisest. And she came and told him she was going to ask him some riddles. And if he could solve them, then she would admit that he was the wisest ruler. So she asked him her first riddle. "When I was alive, I did not move. But when my head was cut off, I moved as fast as the wind. Who am I? Do any of you know?" Fortunately, King Solomon had a lot of experience with riddles, and so he knew, "Why? I am the timbers of a ship, for when I'm alive and my roots are in the ground, I don't move. But when my head is cut off, the leaves and the branches, I am turned into the sides of a ship, and I move exactly as the wind takes me." Well, Balkis had to admit that he was correct. You are indeed very wise. But let's see if you can figure out my next riddle. What part of the earth has only ever seen the sun one time? Do any of you know? What part? Where? I think that's never seen the sun, though. It's inside, so it's all surrounded. Solomon's answer was the bed of the Sea of Reeds, because when it was parted to let the Israelites leave Egypt, the sun shone down on it exactly once, because forever after it was surrounded by water. Well, the Queen of Sheba had to admit he was indeed very wise and had solved her riddle. But she said, "I have something even harder." And so she ordered a cedar tree cut with its top cut off and its roots cut off. and then ordered him to tell her which was the top and which was the bottom. Well, this was harder indeed, because when Solomon looked at it, it was just a trunk. How was he to know which had been the top and which had been the bottom? But he decided to throw it in the water, and he realized that the end that floated down was where the roots had been, and the end that floated up was where all the branches and leaves had been. So again, the Queen of Sheba had to admit that he had solved her riddle and was very wise. But, she said, I have saved my hardest riddle for last, and I know you won't be able to solve this one. And she ordered 50 men and 50 women to enter, and each of them carried a beautiful rose. King Solomon, there is only one real rose among these 50. I have had my best jewelers, my best craft people as skilled as the artisans in this very marketplace, indeed, craft these roses. Tell me which is the real rose. Well, now Solomon got nervous. He looked up, and all he could see was flowers that looked identical. From his great height, there was nothing to give him any kind of clue. He was in despair. But what should happen? But that little bee that had stung his nose came flying in and said, Solomon, now is the time where I will repay you. And the little bee flew from flower to flower to flower until she could tell which one was the real one. And then she just circled, flying in the air around that young maiden. And so King Solomon confidently pointed her out. And the Queen of Sheba had to admit that Solomon had solved all of her riddles and was indeed the wisest ruler. And that little bee buzzed in his ear, indeed, King Solomon, you are the wisest indeed. And so it was, King Solomon